For sale, a Creole girl, age 6 or 8, strong and healthy, well suited for domestic service or export. It is an ordinary advertisement printed on parchment, in faded ink, nestled among the daily notices of Havana, Cartagena, or Salvador da Bahia. Yet behind it lies a world of terror, profit, resistance, and silence. This isn't the South of plantations and Confederate flags. This is Latin America, a region whose economies were built on sugar and gold, and where the history of slavery has long been shrouded in silence. While the U.S. often dominates conversations about the transatlantic slave trade, it received less than 5% of all African captives. The true epicenter was here. Brazil, Cuba, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru formed the backbone of a system that imported over 10 million souls and built entire empires on their backs. Unlike in the U.S., where slavery left visible scars on public memory, much of Latin America's past was carefully buried. Official narratives downplayed the brutality, scholars romanticized the relationships between master and enslaved, and the descendants of those who endured it lived in societies that refused to acknowledge their profound contributions. This is a deeper, darker story that shaped an entire continent. The origins of slavery in Latin America predate the arrival of the first African captives. Enslavement, in some form, already existed within many indigenous societies, particularly among the Maya, Aztec, and Inca, where prisoners of war might be forced into labor, tribute, or ritual sacrifice. However, the European model was different. It was not slavery as punishment or spiritual recompense. This was slavery as an industry. Slavery also existed in Spain itself since Roman times, being cross-cultural and multi-ethnic, playing an important role in the development of European economies. In 1492, Columbus arrived in the Caribbean. By 1493, Pope Alexander VI had sanctioned the conquest and enslavement of all non-Christians in the New World. The Spanish crown swiftly acted, sending conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro to launch devastating campaigns against indigenous empires. Gold was the target. Enslavement was the method, facilitated by the encomienda system, a legal fiction. Under the encomienda system, entire indigenous communities were handed over to Spanish colonists as wards. In theory, the encomendero was obligated to Christianize and protect his assigned population. In reality, they were worked to death in mines, fields, and construction sites. Those who resisted faced execution, starvation, or mutilation. Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish priest, famously wrote of men cut in pieces as if dealing with sheep in the slaughterhouse. The early foundations of slavery in Latin America were built on profound contradictions. The Crown declared that no indigenous person could be enslaved without cause, yet cause was always found. Clergy preached salvation while blessing shackles. Slavery was presented as necessary for development, but it primarily built wealth for Europe, not justice for the Americas. Yet resistance to indigenous enslavement also emerged from within Spanish legal and religious circles, sparking some of the earliest debates about the morality of human bondage in the Western world. In 1511, just 19 years after Columbus's arrival, Dominican friar Antonio de Montesinos delivered a sermon on Hispaniola, condemning the abuse of the native population and affirming their humanity, arguably the first speech in the Americas advocating for the universality of human rights. Bartolomé de las Casas, once a beneficiary of the encomienda, became one of its fiercest critics. He lobbied the Spanish crown for reforms to protect indigenous peoples and played a key role in the 1542 new laws that sought to curb abuses. Tragically, he also proposed replacing indigenous labor with African slaves, an argument he would later regret, but one that helped accelerate the transatlantic slave trade. By the early 1500s, overwork was the fastest killer in Latin America, even before disease took its full toll. Gold and silver mines, especially in regions like Potosí and Zacatecas, devoured laborers. Though not officially slavery, these systems functioned as forced labor drafts. Under the repartimiento, indigenous men were conscripted in rotating shifts to work on farms, in workshops, and especially in mines, often for weeks or months with little or no pay. The mita, adapted from Inca traditions, was especially devastating in Peru and Bolivia. Whole communities were drained of able-bodied men to work in brutal conditions at Potosi's silver mines or Huancavelica's mercury pits. Exposure, exhaustion, and toxic fumes killed thousands. This was a brutal system masked by bureaucracy. Despite religious objections, forced labor was institutionalized, with the crown granting conquistadors rights to extract labor and tribute from non-Christian indigenous people. As indigenous populations plummeted and rebellions flared, the unsustainable nature of this labor system became clear. Colonists needed a more durable labor source, less protected by royal decrees. They turned to Africa. African captives were not new to the Iberian world. Portugal had trafficked enslaved Africans since the 15th century, and Spain used African laborers in Seville and Lisbon. However, the scale of what was about to unfold in the Americas had no precedent. The Spanish crown, constrained by religious doctrine and internal politics, prohibited its own subjects from directly participating in the African slave trade. In 1518, this restriction gave rise to a system of royal outsourcing, the Asiento de Negros. These were contracts granted by the Spanish crown to foreign merchants, authorizing them to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish America. Far from being a bureaucratic formality, the Asiento became one of the most coveted and geopolitically significant commodities in the Atlantic world. Control over the Asiento was a prize that drew in the mightiest empires of Europe. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the Portuguese held the contract. Later, it passed into the hands of Genoese, Dutch, and French financiers. But it was in the early 18th century that the stakes escalated. Following the War of Spanish Succession, the Asiento was awarded to Britain as part of the 1713 Treaty of Utrecht. With that deal, the British South Sea Company gained exclusive rights to deliver 4,800 enslaved Africans per year into Spanish colonies, effectively granting Britain a foothold in the Spanish imperial economy. The Asiento system defined the imperial economy. This monopoly was so lucrative, so politically charged, that it shaped foreign policy for decades. The trade in human beings became a diplomatic bargaining chip. Empires went to war not just for land, but for the right to sell slaves. Naval battles were fought, treaties brokered, alliances broken. Human cargo was the currency of imperial ambition. And while monarchs negotiated contracts in palaces, in the holds of wooden ships, thousands of captives lay shackled in darkness, unaware that their fate was sealed not by one empire, but by the competition between many. The Asiento did more than distribute slaves. It redistributed imperial power. It turned African flesh into an engine of European rivalry and colonial bondage into a catalyst for continental war. Between the 1500s and the 1800s, over 12 million Africans were captured, sold, and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean, the largest forced migration in human history. More than 90% of them were sent not to North America, but to Latin America and the Caribbean. Brazil alone received nearly 5 million enslaved Africans, the largest number of any single country. The Spanish colonies across mainland Latin America absorbed another 2.5 million, totaling approximately 22% of all Africans delivered to American shores. The rest were funneled through coastal hubs like Havana, Cartagena, Veracruz, and Montevideo, ports where chained men, women, and children were bought, branded, and redistributed to inland mines, plantations, and households. This transatlantic pipeline became so profitable that entire European economies depended on it. In Lisbon, slave voyages were underwritten by investors. In Seville, auctions were held in cathedral courtyards. In Cadiz, a major port, profits were projected in how many enslaved Africans could survive the voyage to the New World, aka the Middle Passage, and be sold at auction. Investors calculated mortality rates, insurance payouts for dead captives, and expected labor output as part of their financial modeling. The Middle Passage itself was a horror. Ships were overloaded, food was scarce, and disease was rampant. Captives lay in filth and darkness for weeks or months, stripped of their names and possessions. Those who died were tossed overboard, some jumped, choosing drowning over enslavement. Upon arrival, they were paraded through the streets, inspected like livestock, examined for disease, and sold to the highest bidder. Young men fetched premium prices for plantation labor. Children were often sold in pairs or as companions to elite white families. Women were valued for both their labor and their reproductive potential. The trade was rationalized by religion and law. Catholic doctrine didn't oppose African slavery, and colonial legal codes institutionalized it. Africans were denied rights, kinship ties, and property ownership. They were described as naturally suited for hard labor and tropical climates, a myth perpetuated by European intellectuals and local elites. Names were replaced, languages silenced, and legal status reduced to movable property. Spanish law referred to them as bienes muebles, on par with livestock or farm tools. This system turned West African villages into ghost towns, transformed coastal Latin American cities into slaving ports, and redefined identity itself by reducing human beings to numbers, categories, and commodities. This horrific trade continued for centuries. But even in this early phase, resistance emerged. Some jumped overboard, some rebelled aboard ships, and some killed their captors in port towns before even disembarking. The first open black rebellion in Spanish labor camps occurred in 1521 on the island of Hispaniola near Santo Domingo. Enslaved Africans, forced to work in a sugar mill, launched a coordinated uprising on Christmas Day, setting fires, attacking overseers, and attempting to flee inland. Though quickly suppressed, the revolt shocked colonial authorities and led to harsher controls over enslaved populations. It was the first recorded African slave revolt in the New World, proof that resistance began almost as soon as enslavement did. It set a precedent that would echo through every rebellion and Maroon community that followed. The economies of Latin America were designed to extract gold from rivers, silver from mountains, and sugar from fields. In colonial Colombia, enslaved Africans were the backbone of the gold economy. In Antioquia, 3,000 black workers were recorded in the mines, outnumbering Spaniards 10-1. Conditions were catastrophic. They waded chest-deep in poisoned rivers to separate gold dust from gravel. Others were sent into narrow shafts with no ventilation, no light, and no rest. Collapses were common, and so was death. An account from 1589, buried in the Colombian archives, details the logistics of this system. 11 Africans captured in regions now known as Sierra Leone, Guinea-Bissau, and Angola were trafficked illegally through Panama to avoid royal taxes. After 7 years of brutal labor in Concepcion's forests, they were forcibly marched hundreds of miles inland without food or shelter, sold again, and put back to work. In Peru's silver city of Potosi, enslaved Africans worked with indigenous laborers conscripted under the infamous Mita system. Mita became a mechanism to supply the deadly mines of Potosi with a continuous stream of free labor. The mountain looming over the city, Cerro Rico, the rich hill, was riddled with dark tunnels and shafts. Underground temperatures plunged, and the air was thick with dust and mercury vapor used to refine silver ore. This process slowly poisoned miners, attacking their lungs and nervous systems. There was no protective equipment or medical care. Miners often emerged coughing blood, if they emerged at all. African slaves, brought in to supplement the dwindling indigenous workforce, faced the same perils, but with even fewer legal protections. Many were worked until collapse. Their arrival was not a reprieve, but an extension of the mine's hunger. Miners descended on ladders made of llama hide, carrying torches and hammers. Workdays stretched to 12 or 14 hours. Accidents and cave-ins were constant, making death a normalized occurrence. Workers who died were often buried nearby, without ceremony, their bodies covered with rocks or left in unused shafts. Entire communities in the surrounding highlands were depopulated to feed Potosi's labor needs. Families were torn apart and local economies collapsed. Yet the silver kept flowing, shipped by mule train to the Pacific, loaded onto galleons, and sent to fund the Spanish Empire's expansion across Europe and the Americas. By the early 1600s, Potosi had become one of the largest and richest cities on earth, its cathedrals gilded with silver mined by men who would never see its altar. To the Spanish elite, it was a monument to imperial glory. To those in the tunnels below, it was hell. The encomienda system was finally abolished across the Spanish Empire in 1791, with earlier abolitions in regions like Chile in 1789. Despite the abolition of the encomienda system, indigenous people who rebelled against the Spanish could still be enslaved, as seen in the Mixton War in northwest Mexico and the Arauco War in Chile, where the ban against enslaving Indians captured in war was lifted in 1608. This practice was ultimately abolished for Mapuche rebels in 1683, after decades of violent conflict during the Arauco War in southern Chile. For years, Spanish forces had captured and enslaved Mapuche men, women, and children, justifying it as punishment for rebellion. These captives were sold across Chile and Peru, often through legal channels backed by royal decrees. But growing Mapuche resistance, along with pressure from missionaries and shifting imperial interests, led to a royal ban. In 1683, King Charles II issued a decree prohibiting the enslavement of Mapuche prisoners of war. While illegal enslavement continued in frontier regions, the decree marked one of the first formal acknowledgments that indigenous slavery, especially under the guise of just war, was no longer tenable in imperial policy. Sugar was equally lethal. In Brazil, especially along the northeastern coast in regions like Pernambuco and Bahia, sugar plantations were the colony's economic engine and the graveyard of its labor force. The sugar cycle was relentless. Enslaved Africans were forced into backbreaking labor from dawn until deep into the night, often with only a few hours of rest. Harvesting sugarcane required immense physical strength. Workers slashed through razor-sharp stalks, with machetes under a punishing sun, in fields swarming with insects. The pace was brutal, dictated by the machinery of profit. Overseers on horseback monitored the fields, whips in hand, ready to punish any sign of fatigue or resistance. The fields were only the beginning. In the engenhos, the mills where cane was crushed and refined, the danger intensified. Enslaved people fed stalks into wooden rollers powered by oxen or water wheels. A hand slipping meant it was caught and crushed. Countless records exist of workers losing fingers, arms, and lives. Those who survived the crushing endured the boiling rooms where vats of cane juice simmered at scalding temperatures. The air was thick with steam and smoke, and one misstep could mean fatal burns. Injuries were common and untreated. Plantation owners often chose to replace rather than recover enslaved individuals, as buying new enslaved people was cheaper than healing them. Sick workers were left to die. Pregnant women worked until they gave birth, sometimes in the fields, and were forced to resume labor days later. Children were put to work early, carrying cane and hauling materials. Against this tide of oppression, resistance burned. Not a singular uprising, but a continuous struggle, taking many forms. The most overt was rebellion. From the moment the first captives arrived, revolts broke out on ships, in ports, and on plantations. Early acts of defiance often centered on individual sabotage, breaking tools, feigning illness, slow work, or running away. But some resistance escalated. Enslaved people organized large-scale revolts, sometimes leading to hundreds or thousands of deaths, both enslaved and enslaver. These rebellions were often brutally suppressed by colonial militias. However, the ultimate act of collective resistance was the formation of Maroon communities, palenques in Spanish America, quilombos in Brazil, or cumbis in Venezuela. These were autonomous settlements established by formerly enslaved people in remote, inaccessible areas like dense jungles, mountains, or swamps. These communities were true havens of freedom. Here, African languages, spiritual practices, and social structures were recreated and preserved. Maroons built their own defenses, cultivated their own food, and organized their own governance systems. They often launched raids on plantations to free others, acquire supplies, and disrupt the slave economy. The most famous Maroon community in Spanish America was San Basilio de Palenque in present-day Colombia. Founded in the early 17th century by Bencos Viejo, a formerly enslaved king from the Kingdom of Congo, Palenque maintained its independence for over 200 years. Viejo led numerous revolts and negotiated a peace treaty with the Spanish crown in 1603, recognizing Palenque's autonomy, though the Spanish later betrayed him, capturing and executing him in 1621. Despite this, Palenque endured and thrives today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Other significant Maroon communities emerged across the continent. In Mexico, Gaspar Yanga led a rebellion in Veracruz in the early 17th century, establishing San Lorenzo de los Negros, another autonomous settlement that forced the Spanish to grant its freedom in 1609. These acts of rebellion and the formation of Maroon communities were not just isolated incidents. They fundamentally challenged the legitimacy of the slave system. They forced colonial powers to dedicate vast resources to tracking, fighting, and, at times, negotiating with these free Black communities. They inspired further resistance and stood as beacons of hope for millions still enslaved. The formal abolition of slavery in Latin America was a complex and drawn-out process, influenced by a confluence of internal resistance, shifting economic landscapes, and external pressures, primarily from Great Britain. Unlike the U.S. Civil War, which resulted in a swift, albeit violent, end to slavery, abolition in Latin America unfolded over decades, with different countries enacting laws at different times. Haiti was the first nation in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery, achieving its independence from France in 1804 through a massive enslaved rebellion led by Toussaint Louverture. This radical act sent shockwaves across the Americas, terrifying slaveholding elites and inspiring enslaved people throughout the region. Throughout the 19th century, as Latin American nations fought for independence from Spain and Portugal, the question of slavery became intertwined with nationalist movements. Simón Bolívar, the liberator, emancipated enslaved people who joined his army, recognizing the inherent contradiction of fighting for freedom while upholding slavery. However, upon achieving independence, many new republics, cautious of upsetting powerful landowners, enacted gradual abolition laws. Chile, for instance, abolished slavery in 1823, one of the earliest to do so. Mexico followed in 1829. Argentina saw a gradual abolition beginning in 1813, with full emancipation in 1853. Peru abolished slavery in 1854. Cuba and Brazil, with their massive sugar economies, were among the last to abolish slavery in 1886 and 1888, respectively. These nations had the most to lose economically, and their abolition was often the result of intense international pressure, internal slave revolts, and the declining profitability of slave labor. The end of formal slavery did not mean the end of racial inequality. The structures of power and wealth built on centuries of forced labor continue to shape societies. Formerly enslaved people and their descendants often face systemic discrimination, economic marginalization, and social exclusion. New forms of labor exploitation emerge, such as debt peonage and the indentured servitude of Asian laborers known as chinos and coolies, particularly in Cuba and Peru, which continued well into the late 19th century. Across Latin America, the legacy of slavery is complex and enduring. Black and Indigenous communities continue to struggle against racism, poverty, and lack of representation. They are overrepresented among the poor, underrepresented in politics, and often denied full citizenship by systemic neglect. Despite the massive scale and brutality of slavery in Latin America, its memory has been largely suppressed or distorted. For centuries, official narratives downplayed its impact, focusing instead on European colonial achievements or the struggles for independence. This historical amnesia served to maintain social hierarchies and obscure the profound contributions and suffering of enslaved and indigenous populations. One key factor in this silence was the concept of mestizaje, or racial mixing. While often celebrated as a unique aspect of Latin American identity, the ideology of mestizaje could also be used to argue that racial divisions were less rigid than in the United States, thereby downplaying the specific experiences of Afro-descendant and indigenous communities. The idea was that everyone was mixed, and therefore, racial discrimination or the legacy of slavery was less severe. In reality, racial hierarchies persisted, with lighter skin tones often correlating with higher social status and economic opportunity. Education systems often omitted or glossed over the harsh realities of slavery. Textbooks might mention the arrival of Africans, but rarely delve into the forced labor, resistance, or long-term consequences. This deliberate omission left generations of Latin Americans with an incomplete and often sanitized understanding of their own history. The physical landscape itself bears the marks of this forgotten past. Churches, government buildings, and infrastructure across the continent were built with enslaved labor, yet their plaques rarely acknowledge the hands that built them. Sugar mills, mines, and haciendas, sites of immense suffering, are often presented as historical relics, stripped of the human stories of pain and resistance that defined them. The cultural legacy, however, has proven more resilient. African languages may have faded, but rhythms, recipes, religions, and philosophies survive. The indelible mark of these traditions is visible and celebrated throughout the continent. Slavery in Latin America was not softer and it wasn't kinder. It was simply hidden by the church, by the state, by scholars, and by time. But history remembers, and so must we.